Once upon a time, in a quiet little village nestled between rolling green hills, there lived a young woman named Clara. She was gentle, hard-working, and kind, the kind of person who made everyone around her feel warm just by smiling. Clara worked as a housekeeper at Elmwood Manor, a grand old estate owned by a wealthy nobleman named Lord Edward. The manor was impressive, with tall stone walls, wide wooden hallways, and gardens that stretched as far as the eye could see. Every morning Clara would rise before the sun and begin her duties. She swept the floors, polished the silverware, and tended to the beautiful rose garden that wrapped around the front of the manor. She never complained, not once. Even on cold, rainy mornings when the work felt never-ending, Clara would hum softly to herself and carry on. The other servants admired her for that, her quiet strength and her warm heart. Lord Edward was a different story altogether. He was tall, well-dressed, and respected by everyone in the village. He had inherited Elmwood Manor from his father, along with all its land and responsibilities. But despite all his wealth and status, Lord Edward often seemed lonely. He moved through his grand home like a shadow, present but somehow distant. His days were filled with meetings, letters, and duties, but his evenings were always quiet and empty. One morning, Lord Edward decided to walk through the garden before his meetings began. It was something he rarely did, but that particular morning, something pulled him outside. And that is when he saw her. Clara was kneeling beside a row of red roses, carefully trimming the stems with a small pair of scissors. She was speaking softly, not to anyone nearby, but to the flowers themselves. "There you go. A little more sun, a little more room to breathe. You'll do just fine." Lord Edward stopped walking. He watched her for a moment, surprised by what he saw. There was something so honest about the way she cared for those roses, so gentle and real. He had never noticed it before, but now, standing in the early morning light, he could not look away. "Good morning," he said, at last, stepping closer. Clara looked up quickly, her eyes wide with surprise. She stood and gave a small bow. "Good morning, my lord." Her voice was steady, but her cheeks turned a soft shade of pink. "You speak to the flowers," he said, not unkindly. There was a faint curiosity in his voice. Clara hesitated for just a second, then smiled. "Yes, my lord. I find that they grow better when they feel noticed." Lord Edward raised an eyebrow. "Is that so?" "Plants are not so different from people," she said quietly. "They just want a little care, a little attention." He stood there for a moment thinking about her words. Then, without quite knowing why, he smiled. It was a small smile, but it was real, and for Lord Edward, that was rare. After that morning, something shifted in the manor. Lord Edward began walking through the garden more often, sometimes before breakfast, sometimes in the late afternoon. And slowly, without either of them planning it, he and Clara began to talk. At first, their conversations were short and simple. He would ask about the garden, she would answer carefully, always respectful. But over time, the words between them grew longer, warmer, more honest. He told her about the weight of running the estate, the pressure, the expectations, the loneliness he rarely admitted to anyone. She listened without judgment, nodding gently, offering kind words when he needed them. And she, in turn, shared small pieces of her own life, her childhood in a simple cottage, her love of books, her dream of one day seeing the ocean. Lord Edward discovered that Clara was not just hard-working, she was wise. She saw the world in a way he had never thought to look at it. And the more they talked, the more he realized that her presence made everything feel lighter, easier somehow. The weeks passed, the garden bloomed, and so did something quiet between them, something neither of them dared to name. One evening, the manor was alive with music and laughter. Lord Edward had hosted a formal dinner for several important guests from the city. The dining hall glittered with candlelight and crystal glasses. Ladies in silk gowns and gentlemen in fine coats filled the room with chatter and laughter. But Lord Edward's eyes kept drifting, past the guests, past the long table, toward the doorway where Clara moved quietly in the background, carrying trays and refilling glasses. She wore no fine gown, no jewels, no ribbons in her hair, but she moved with a kind of grace that none of the other guests seemed to have. And Lord Edward felt something in his chest that he had never felt before, something he could no longer ignore. After the dinner ended and the guests had gone, Lord Edward found himself walking into the garden alone. The night was clear, and the moon hung full and bright above the trees. He stood among the roses for a long time, thinking. Then he heard soft footsteps behind him. He turned. It was Clara, carrying a small lantern, returning from an errand inside the manor. She stopped when she saw him. "Forgive me, my lord, I did not mean to disturb you." "You are not disturbing me," he said quickly. "Please, stay, just for a moment." Clara paused, then nodded gently. The two of them stood together in the garden, the moon pouring its silver light across the roses. After a long silence, Lord Edward turned to her. His voice was quiet, almost careful, as if the words were fragile things. "Clara," he said, "I need to tell you something." She looked at him, waiting. These past weeks, our conversations, our mornings in this garden, they have meant more to me than I know how to say. He paused, drawing a slow breath. I have begun to realize that the best part of my day is you. Clara's heart beat faster. She stood very still, not trusting herself to speak. I know that what I am saying may surprise you. It surprises me too, if I'm being honest. But I would be a fool to stay silent any longer. Clara, I think I have fallen in love with you. The words hung in the night air between them, soft and serious all at once. Clara looked into his eyes, and what she saw there was not performance, not politeness. It was something real, something she had quietly been afraid to hope for. "My lord," she whispered, "I have tried so hard not to feel what I feel." She paused, her voice trembling just slightly. "But I have failed, because I feel it too." A slow smile crossed Lord Edward's face, the kind of smile that comes from deep relief. He reached out and took her hand gently in both of his. "Then let us stop pretending," he said. "Let us be honest, and let us be brave." Clara squeezed his hand and looked up at the sky full of stars. In that quiet garden, under the light of the full moon, something beautiful and true had finally been spoken aloud. The weeks that followed were not easy, not for either of them. Word spread through the village quickly, as it always does in small places. Some people whispered that Lord Edward had lost his senses. Others said that Clara had gotten above herself. But Edward did not waver, and neither did Clara. He introduced her not as a servant, but as the woman who had changed his life. He stood beside her in the village market, in the church, and at the gate of the manor, calm and unashamed. And slowly, one by one, the whispers faded, because the people of the village began to see what was plain and simple: two people who made each other better. That was something no title or gossip could argue with. As the seasons turned, Clara and Edward built a life together inside those old stone walls. They filled the manor with warmth, with real laughter, honest conversations, and the kind of quiet comfort that only grows between two people who truly know each other. Clara kept her garden. She always would. But now, Edward often came to help, his sleeves rolled up, hands in the soil, the two of them working side by side. He was not always graceful at it, but he was willing, and to Clara, that meant everything. One golden afternoon in early autumn, the two of them sat beneath an old oak tree at the far edge of the garden. The leaves were just beginning to turn, pale gold and deep orange, drifting slowly to the ground. Clara rested her head on Edward's shoulder, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. Then Edward turned to her, his eyes steady and warm. He reached into the pocket of his coat and brought out a small velvet box. Inside sat a simple gold ring set with a single pearl, not the largest jewel in the world, but carefully chosen. "Clara," he said, "will you stay with me? Not as my housekeeper, not as my friend, but as my wife." Tears filled Clara's eyes before she could stop them. She laughed softly, that surprised, joyful kind of laugh, and pressed her mouth to her mouth. Then she nodded. "Yes, Edward. Yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and they sat together beneath the oak tree as the autumn wind moved gently through the branches above them. No crowd, no ceremony, just two people, and one very honest moment. It was, perhaps, the most beautiful proposal Elmwood Manor had ever seen. Their wedding was held in the garden, of course. Where else could it have been? The roses were still in late bloom, and Clara had woven wildflowers into her hair. She wore a simple ivory dress, nothing elaborate, and she looked, as everyone agreed later, absolutely radiant. Edward stood at the garden gate, waiting. And when he saw her walking towards him through the flowers, his eyes filled with tears he did not try to hide. The village vicar read the vows. The guests cheered, and when Edward kissed his bride, even the old gardener wiped his eyes with his sleeve. The years brought many things, seasons of joy and seasons of difficulty. There were arguments, as there always are between two strong people who care deeply. There were days when the weight of the estate pressed down hard, days when the world outside the manor walls was unkind. But Edward and Clara always came back to the garden. It was their place, their reset, their peace. Whenever something felt too heavy, they would walk among the roses and talk. And somehow, among the flowers, they always found their way back to each other. In time, the manor filled with the sounds of children. A son named Thomas, who had his father's serious eyes and his mother's gentle laugh, and a daughter named Rose, because of course her name was Rose, who followed Clara through the garden from the moment she could walk. One evening, as the fire crackled softly in the sitting room and the children slept upstairs, Clara and Edward sat together in their favorite chairs. The room was quiet and warm, the kind of quiet that feels like a gift. Edward looked over at Clara, at the soft lines around her eyes, the calm certainty in her face, and he felt something so full and deep he could barely find words for it. "Do you remember the first morning?" he asked. Clara smiled without looking up from her book. The roses, she said. You were talking to them, he said. She laughed softly. And I thought you were strange. I thought you were remarkable, he said. She looked up then, and the look that passed between them needed no more words. He reached over and took her hand. She turned her palm up and held his fingers. And they stayed like that, quiet, together, content, as the fire burned low and the stars came out above the garden. Their love was not a loud love. It was not the kind written in grand letters or declared from rooftops. It was the quiet kind, steady, patient, and deep. The kind that shows up every single day in small ways. A cup of tea left on the windowsill, a hand offered in the dark, a seat saved beside the fire. The villagers would say in later years that Elmwood Manor had changed when Clara arrived, that the old stone walls seemed somehow warmer, that the garden had never bloomed so brightly, and that Lord Edward, who had once moved through his grand home like a shadow, had finally, at last, come alive. They were right. He had, because love, real love, does not arrive like thunder. It arrives quietly, in the middle of an ordinary morning, beside a row of roses. And if you are paying attention, you will see it growing. Now, before you go, here is something to think about. Clara never set out to change Lord Edward's life. She was simply being herself, kind, honest, and present, and that was enough. More than enough. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is show up exactly as you are. No performance, no pretending. Just you, real and true. Because the right people will see you, and when they do, everything changes. If you enjoyed this story, you know what to do. Stay with us here at Fluent Harbor, because there are more stories just like this one waiting for you. Stories of love, courage, hope, and the quiet magic of ordinary life. We will see you in the next one.